Welcome back. Switching to a new topic now, so got some interesting stuff coming your way. My name is Erin Caughey. I'm a recent graduate from the Diedrich College Communication journalism major. I worked with Dan Egan on his Great Lakes project with the O'Brien Fellowship. I was also the intern at the Journal Sentinel this summer, so I got to continue with the project into the summer. Still working there for a little while longer. And we're going to get into what Dan did with his time on the O'Brien Fellowship and what I was able to contribute. So, Dan wants to.
I guess I'll stand up here too for now. I cover Great Lakes issues for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. I've been doing it since 2002 or 2003. The managing editor at the paper, George, approached me about doing the fellowship. It was probably about 2 years ago. And he had already kind of had an idea of what he wanted, and I didn't really have much of an idea. And so we sat down and we conceived this, and it's basically stories are supposed to have beginning, middles, and ends, and this one doesn't. This one really starts in the middle. We decided that 2013, 2014 was a really critical year for Great Lakes issues for a couple of reasons. The series is basically about invasive species, and invasive species make their way into the lake primarily through, we for shorthand call it the front door, which is the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that's ships sailing in from overseas, and they often come in with contaminated ballast water, historically have, and that's how we have 186 non-native species. That's how we have 60, basically, since the St. Lawrence Seaway opened in 1959. This is an important year for that issue because in December, after more than a decade of refusing to do its job, the Environmental Protection Agency agreed to start requiring these ships to treat their ballast water before they discharge. Problem is, the requirements don't go nearly far enough to actually stop the next zebra mussel or quagga mussel or round goby from coming in. So we decided we'd do a story on issues facing the front door, and with the idea that it's actually worse to think that you've solved a problem than to actually just openly acknowledge that you still have one, and that's the situation. So that was the front door. The back door is the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. That's the pathway for Asian carp to make their way up from the Mississippi Basin to Lake Michigan. And it was an important year this year for this issue because the Army Corps of Engineers, after 2 or 3 years of studying the issue, released a plan on how to plug these canals and how to stop the carp and whatever species might be behind it. There are a number, including I think it's northern snakehead, which is the fish that can live out of water and has nasty teeth. So here's where we started. A little bit of how the sausage gets made. This was the first installment. It was in, I believe, February of this year, and it is not the story that I wrote initially. I had written almost a very, as I remember it, a completely different version. It was much more approachable and accessible as far as introducing people to the issue right from the beginning, so you can engage a reader who may know nothing or care nothing about this issue. You grab them and you just tell a story. Well, Greg Borowski, the project's editor, and George Stanley weren't ready or weren't interested in that story. They really wanted an analysis of the Army Corps' plan. And it turned out that was a good idea because the Army Corps' plan, I would say, it's almost petulant in what they put together. They devised a plan that will indeed plug this canal, but it will cost almost $20 billion and take a quarter century. And the reason for that being that they decided not one drop of additional pollution could go into Lake Michigan if they were to deploy this plug in the river. And that's important because right now Chicago has some of the dirtiest treated sewage in the country. And it just goes into the canal, which flows down into the Mississippi River Basin, and it ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. The Army Corps, in approaching this problem, decided that they could not look at Asian carp as a form of pollution. The director of the study told me very explicitly that they could not consider biological things as pollutants, which is just patently absurd. I mean, it's the reason we have sewage treatment. It's because there's live things in sewage and people can get sick from it. He subsequently denied telling me this in an email that must have been blind copied all the way up the chain of command. He didn't deny it. He said that he may have said something to that effect, but it was in a greater, larger context. He had forgotten that it was an email and that there was no ambiguity, and I replied and hit the reply all, hoping that it went to these blind CC'd people and said, actually, here's your email. You show me the ambiguity. I think we're going to put this up online as well. And I never heard from him again until about a month later. I was at the Great Lakes Day in Washington, D.C., and they had a gathering at the Canadian Embassy, and he approached me and he said, I went back and looked at that email, and you're right. That's what I said. And that is such a fundamental flaw in their approach to solving this problem, because if they can't agree to send something a little less than, they're basically saying they'd have to treat all the water in Chicago, all the sewage, to basically drinking water standards, which is just it's impossible or wildly expensive. If you start with that premise, you've failed right from the beginning, and that's what they did. They failed. There are people who have been looking at this since, I believe, 2003, when then Mayor Daley convened a conference with a bunch of biologists, engineers, agency experts, and they were brainstorming because these reviled carp were on the march back then, and they knew that they had to do something significant and permanent to stop the problem, and they came up with this idea. They call it hydrologic separation. It's basically damming the canal. After that, in 2003, there were a couple of studies done at least. I may be forgetting some, but people started looking at, well, wow, how could we rechannel this water? I mean, some of it we're going to end up treating some sewage that now goes down into the Mississippi. It's going to go back into the lake, but if we do it strategically, we don't have to send every drop of Chicago sewage back into the lake at Perrier quality. And then in 2011, a rather large study funded by the Great Lakes Commission and a group of mayors representing the Great Lakes cities came out with a plan that was, it was not back of the envelope, but it was done in 18 months. And from my position, they got the essentials right. And this is a video of what they came up with, and it's what the Corps would like to do as well, except for they added bells and whistles to it to the tune of some extra $15 billion. So this will explain the issue better than what I was just saying.
Well, maybe. Oh, looks like we have flash on here, so we might not be able to show this.
Yeah, we can move on to the...
I'll have a link to this presentation so everyone can access it if they want to see these videos later. I can give that to Herb and he can pass it along.
That was the back door. So that story ran in February, and I soon thereafter started working on the story we're calling the front door. It was actually a 4-day series, and it starts in 1988 with the arrival of the first zebra mussel. At that point, the Great Lakes had been steadily invaded by all sorts of fish and plants and bugs, and there was a concern that these mussels could get in. They were specifically identified in a couple of studies as likely invaders, and nobody really worried about it because these mussels are really no bigger than your fingernail, and it's kind of hard to think of something that small being that disastrous for something as big as the Great Lakes, which spans some 93,000 square miles. It started with one mollusk, one mussel. So will these play or not?
I'll try this one. I might just...
You could just run and get my computer too if it would switch over.
it's probably not going to play because of this computer, but
Okay.
we'll make.
A college student on a field trip looking for snails pulled up something that nobody recognized, and they sent it to a mollusk expert at a university in Canada, and he identified it as zebra mussel, which is native to the Caspian Sea basin. And nobody was too worried right away, but in a matter of months, they started finding literally millions of them. It was just like a virus invaded a bloodstream, and within a year, they were finding them at densities that are, it's hard to even grasp. I mean, today you'll find them in Lake Michigan, an average of 10,000 per square meter. And if you think about that, you can't even visualize 10,000 things the size of your fingernail on a square meter, but they cluster, and it becomes like a coral. And it gets thick, and as Harvey, who knows more about these than anybody I've ever met, and probably anybody, is he can tell you, he dives out there quite a bit. They now blanket the bottom of Lake Michigan. I mean, it is just like a carpet out there, and they filter feed 24 hours a day. That means they're sucking the plankton out of the water, which is the bottom of the food chain that sustains everything above it. And the fisheries have suffered accordingly. It's a system in flux. Maybe it's fortunate, it probably is. Another invader came in after the zebra mussels, and it eats zebra mussels. It's called a round goby, and that's actually working out as a potential benefit to the system, in that they eat the mussels and other things eat them, so the mussels are no longer a nutritional dead end in a lake that can't really afford any further losses. So the story starts with finding the mollusk, and it moves on to the idea that finally, after more than a decade of lawsuits, the Environmental Protection Agency starts requiring ballast treatment systems to kill these bugs and critters that are lurking in ballast tanks. And real quickly, ballast tanks are used on freighters to stabilize loads, cargoes, because it's not like you fill up a 700-foot freighter uniformly with, pick your product, sand, and it's perfectly balanced. So they need these tanks. They need to take water in and take it out depending on what's in the cargo holds or what the weather is like. The problem is you pick up water in one port, you pick up what's in the water, and when you discharge that water, you discharge it into the Great Lakes, which were isolated from the rest of the aquatic world by Niagara Falls for 10,000 years before we started monkeying with them. Problem with the EPA rules are the problems are legion. I mean, it's basically, it almost gets into philosophy. How do you sterilize a cubic meter of water? I mean, it's basically impossible to make it lifeless. We can't sterilize a hospital room, let alone these cargo tanks that can hold millions and millions of gallons of water. So the government spent a long time trying to figure out what is suitably sterile, what's clean enough, and the answer is they don't know. And the only number they could agree upon when they started looking at it is 0, and there really is no good way to get to 0 with existing technology unless you look at the problem differently. And that is, maybe you don't let the ships in to begin with. And that is anathema in this area because we are a Great Lakes city, and the Great Lakes have the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that connects us to the rest of the world, and it's a great idea. But the reality is the St. Lawrence Seaway is basically a narrow gauge railroad in a modern world. The ships are too small, or the blocks are too small to handle modern size freighters, so it's basically a boutique business. We receive, the numbers are always, I think they're always shrinking. They may blip up now and again, but it's less than 2 ships a day continent-wide come up the St. Lawrence Seaway. And for that, we've got these 186 non-native species in the lake. So the story looks at thinking about the problem differently, looking at the St. Lambert Lock, which is the first lock on the St. Lawrence River, which allows these ships to come inland. It's 80 feet wide. It's an exquisite pinch point. You stop things at that gate, and you protect a whole continent. You open up that gate, you open up a whole continent to a whole bunch of trouble, which takes us to the last story of this backdoor series. And that is basically how once something gets into the Great Lakes, it doesn't stop there. And quagga mussels in particular have become a multi-billion-dollar problem on a national level. They just recently invaded Lake Powell out in Utah, which is held back by Glen Canyon Dam, which produces ungodly megawatts to power the Southwest. And these mussels are like plaque in an artery. They can gum things up real fast. So they're going to be in a battle against these things forever. The interesting thing about the Western story is they recognize how troublesome these invasive species can be, and they've gotten very, very aggressive in policing people with boats and trying to stop them from spreading, to the point that in Washington State, people are being prosecuted with felonies for moving mussels into the state. The only protection until these treatment systems on the seaway are phased in, the only protection the Great Lakes have right now is that ships have to promise to fill their ballast tanks up with salt water before entering the lakes to kill any freshwater organisms. And it's been working, but it's by no means a 100% solution. If a shipper doesn't do that, they're typically fined, I'm going from memory here, but I think it's $3,500 for a 1,000-foot freighter. I found a guy from Wisconsin who was moving a pleasure craft on wheels from Arizona to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and he got stopped at the Ohio border, or at the Utah border, and ended up, once everything was settled out of, he was charged with a Class A misdemeanor and ended up costing him about $30,000. So it's arguably absurd what length we're willing to go to here in this region to stop the next invasion compared to what's happening out west. It's a national issue, and it needs to be recognized as such. And only when it is will, I think, appropriate steps be taken to look at a permanent solution to the problem. That was the back door. We've done the front door. We've got one more here. So I said the story has a middle and an end. We're still in the middle here. Our idea for the series was if we close the back door and we close the front door and we stop this onslaught of invasive species, at one point we were getting a new one every 8 months. It's significantly slowed, but it's still open. Suppose we do shut the door, what next? It's not like we're taking great care of the lakes ourselves. There's some regional internal problems that need to be dealt with. And right now, one of the biggest issues is phosphorus, which is, again, Harvey. I don't like talking about this with Harvey in the room because he's the man. I'm just a journalist. But it's causing toxic algae outbreaks all across the Great Lakes, from Green Bay to Lake Erie, which is where I went at the end of July. This story had very interesting timing because the ballast water piece ran, and I get nervous when a story runs, and I had to get out of town so I wouldn't be checking my email obsessively. And so I left on a Sunday. I believe it was July 27th, and reported the story on a Monday, a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, talking to people in Toledo and the area around there, what it's going to take for people to realize the danger posed by this algae, which is literally potentially deadly. There's a dog that just died from it in Utah last week. 50-some people died in Brazil back in the 90s when some water contaminated by this algae got into it at a dialysis center. It's serious stuff. I spent 4 or 5 days talking to people, and the consensus was basically it's going to take a major city losing its water supply. I got home Thursday night, and that was probably July 31st or 30th. And at 1:20 a.m. on August 2nd, the Saturday morning, bam, Toledo lost its water. And it was the first time this has ever happened in a major city in North America. And it was, what happened there is positively frightening. They had to call the National Guard to bring in water by the pallet. By 6 a.m., grocery stores were just empty. The stores that were open had no water on their shelves, all the way up to Ann Arbor, which is like 60 miles away. They were bringing baby formula in by the National Guard because you can't boil this water like you can with our crypto outbreak at the beginning of the 90s. Boiling it will only concentrate the toxin. So you got 500,000 people living on the world's largest freshwater resource, and they can't drink a drop of it, and that's serious. So writing the story was very interesting. It took some convincing to just let it unfold chronologically. Of course, by this point, everybody knew that Toledo lost its water, but we kind of told it as it unfolded for me while I was there, and I think it worked to make it, as I was saying earlier, kind of accessible and more of a story. From Toledo, I went up to Green Bay, where they have not identical but similar issues, phosphorus overloads. In this case, it's from factory farming. It's from more than 100,000 cows doing what cows do in that watershed, and not a drop of it gets treated. It gets put on crops, and then it's often too much for the crops to handle, and it washes into the rivers, and it ends up in the bay, and you have fish die-offs. One of the problems is, if we had the video, we could show it creates, ironically, this explosion in life fueled by the manure, or the phosphorus in the manure, creates a dead zone, because all that life dies and it burns up oxygen to the point where almost nothing can survive it. And so again, here we have the world's premier freshwater resource, and it's deadly to almost anything living in it at certain times of year in certain areas. I have one more story that I'm working on, and that's looking forward. So we have a middle and an end, the end being where to from here. And it's going to look at the history of salmon in the Great Lakes and how they solved one of the most bizarre and profound and big environmental problems ever to hit the continent, and that's when alewives basically took over the lake. We decided to plant Pacific salmon to suppress the alewives, and it created a freshwater fishery like nobody could have imagined. It would be like if you love to ski, all of a sudden somebody was able to tow the Rocky Mountains over here, because the fishing on the lake was unparalleled. People were catching 6 fish in an hour within 2 or 3 years of the salmon planting. It was a 1960s solution, and it's become arguably, I will argue, a 2014 problem, because we got hooked on that fishery, and now we are managing for these alewives, which turn out to be a real problem for native species. So in order to prop up this wildly popular but non-native Chinook salmon, which really doesn't belong here any more than Asian carp do, we are compromising the native species, which occupy many more areas of the lake and do things differently. And in this sense, they can work as a white blood cell, in that if something like Asian carp does breach the Chicago Canal system, and they will, I would bet, you'll have more things out there to eat them. And so it's, this last story is looking forward and, respecting the decisions that were made 50 years ago and putting them in their context, but prodding people to look forward a little bit and think about things in a new way. Erin.
Yeah, I'm not up here just to push the computer buttons, I swear. Yeah, as part of the fellowship, which has been an amazing opportunity, I got to work alongside Dan here throughout his time writing these stories. So I got to help him research, got to help with some video and photos and a lot of fun stuff. Got to continue on in the summer for an internship where I continued working with this project. And one of those ways was, I promise this link will work, was helping to build his online presentation of these stories. So I got to go through the process of building out these template pages they have so it can present it online. And part of that also was building these interactive timelines that show, give a good visual as to some of the stuff Dan's talking about. So this one I worked on with 2 other students during the first semester of the O'Brien Fellowship, Victor Jacobo and Monique Collins, who can't be here. But the 3 of us put together this timeline mapping Chicago history along with Asian carp history and kind of showing where they collide and how they have affected the Great Lakes and how they will continue to in the future. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'll show you a couple slides. And then, so I went through all 4 parts of his series like this. So this was the beginning of the front door of the St. Lawrence Seaway side, so you see the mussels. And the really cool part is I got to actually hang out with Harvey Bootsma, who we'll hear from later, and go out on the boat with them and shoot some video and photos. And I promise this video will actually work. When Dan was talking about all the mussels that are coating the bottom of the lake, this is kind of what we saw. And I was pulling a one-woman band on the boat with a couple cameras. It probably looked pretty silly, but Harvey helped us out with this.
Well, we started doing most of this around 2006, so we've been doing it for about 8 years. We get out diving about every 2 weeks, focused mainly on one station, which is what we call the Atwater station, because it's just offshore of Atwater Beach. And our sampling includes water sampling to measure water chemistry, mainly nutrients in the water, and measuring algae in the lake, especially in the bottom of the lake, how much algae is growing, and also measuring quagga mussels, the abundance of mussels and also their size, which we can use to determine how fast they're growing. Probably the biggest change is we used to have just zebra mussels in the lake. They were only in the nearshore area. Now they've been replaced by the quagga mussel. Also in that same time, the round goby, which is another invasive species, has come into Lake Michigan. It was here in 2006, but in very low numbers. But since then it's exploded and it's the dominant fish in the nearshore system now.
All that green stuff that was sticking to the bottom, algae obviously forming on top of the massive amounts of quagga mussels on the bottom of Lake Michigan. And the round goby was also in that last little shot. So that was, this went all the way back to the beginning, didn't it? That was part of my experience with Dan, also producing all of his work. I got to shoot some video and photos. Overall, I think one thing that really stuck with me was I'm a Michigan native, so I grew up on the Great Lakes, and I saw all this happening as a child, but never really understood what it meant. So coming and kind of getting the full picture from working with Dan and getting to talk to Harvey and talk to some of the people around here, it was very interesting to see and hear. Especially one thing that stuck with me from talking with Harvey, is that up top, if you look at the beaches, well, not necessarily the beaches, but if you look at the surface of the water, it looks the same as it did hundreds of years ago. But underneath the water is really what's been the biggest change, and it's affecting everything. So personal experience, that was great for me to see. And that is about what we got.
Questions?
Yeah, questions, anyone, sorry.
Is your series over now, Dan, or are you going to continue on?
No, I've got this last installment. It'll probably be 2 or 3 more stories of a similar length, probably, about the future, about management choices that we're making. What's really interesting is on Lake Huron, it was the same situation as Lake Michigan, where it was an alewife salmon ecosystem. That's what the Michigan Department of Natural Resources managed it for. And the alewife disappeared, primarily because the mussels took all the food, and then they were putting too many salmon into the system, because some of the salmon also started reproducing naturally, and they lost them. And what's happened since then is the native species have returned. So it's like it's stitching itself back together. The bottom of the food chain doesn't look anything like it used to, but the top is starting to look like it used to. And they're getting to the point where they may not have to do any stocking. It could be a self-sustaining system. So it's really, it's fascinating to see. It's encouraging. It's going to be politically contentious if this happens on Lake Michigan, because people love fishing for salmon. They got addicted to them. So no, I'm not done. I hope to be done. This would run sometime in late November.
But that gives potential solutions and opportunities.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you please discuss hull incrustations, barnacles, and other biological life that attaches itself to the exterior of a hull and may drop off some spawn into the lakes, a camera maybe at the entrance to the Welland Canal, something like that, just to demonstrate that it may be a problem?
Yeah, I think it is a potential problem. I've focused mostly on ballast, but I know anchors and chains can be a potential problem as well. I think there are some options as far as specific paints and chemicals that can go to some degree to address that. But ballast is pretty much the primary vector that people are worried about now. Again, the ballast solution would solve the hull solution too. The solution being, let's look at what it would cost to not let them in. I should also say, I failed to mention that there was a study done that looked exactly at this question: what would it cost if we stopped letting these ships in terms of additional costs to bring in? It's mostly inbound steel and outbound grain. And if you were to stop those boats at the St. Lambert Lock or somewhere before that, put it on trains or barges or trucks, it's $55 million a year. It's a pittance compared to the economic costs, but also the ecological ones, which are unfathomable. So that's all I can say about that.
Dan, could you talk about who and or what are the biggest obstacles to a solution?
What would be inertia? I think we've always done it this way, as far as allowing saltwater ships into the lakes. It should be, I got to mention that we haven't had a new species since 2006, but that needs to be caveated, if that's a word, with the fact that nobody's looking for anything new. And you may be good for 10 years, but then you get one new one, and we've seen with the quagga mussels. I mean, they weren't news when they were discovered. They were like a bit player compared to the zebra mussels, and for some reason they exploded a little over 10 years ago. So I think it's just people are entrenched in doing things the way that they used to do, and they're to a large degree not educated about what the stakes are and what's happened. And that's one of the challenges of this kind of journalism. It's not like you uncover some kind of gross malfeasance and you've got a fat target to knock down. These are more like body punches where it's a process of educating people to the point where all of a sudden it reaches public discussion and people start looking at solutions differently.
Wondered what level of cooperation you saw among the states, the 5 or 6 states, as well as the Canadian government that are directly affected by this?
I think that there's a spirit of cooperation evidenced by the Great Lakes Compact, which prohibits any withdrawals of Great Lakes water outside of the Great Lakes Basin. That fractured a bit with the arrival of Asian carp, because Chicago isn't interested in closing down its canal system, and neither is Indiana. When you go internationally, the Canadians look at the Seaway largely as their own, and it largely is. We own 2 of the locks on the section that actually is the formal Seaway. But that's by design. I mean, we built those locks because we wanted to be able to close them if we had to. I see it more as a federal issue than the states. I think the states are the ones that are suffering. The federal government's the one that can solve it. So,
Dan, as what I marvel about is the narrative skill that you have in telling this story. As a city boy from Camden, New Jersey, never heard or thought about quagga mussels or anything like that. Do you think about the audience? Tell us how you think about the audience as you're trying to tell this kind of story that may not resonate with everyone like many other kinds of stories do.
Yeah, I try to just think of it as when you can. I couldn't in January or February when we just did this very meticulous analysis. I mean, that was not a story. That was a report, I would call it. But I try to make things a story, make them interesting. If I find myself talking to my wife about something and she's interested, or some of my friends at the lunch table, then, that gives me confidence that, hey, this, just because it's important and complicated doesn't mean that you can't approach it in a way that is for lack of a better word, accessible, where you want to know, okay, what happens next. And I think people like being able to figure out complicated things, or they like to have complicated things explained in a way that makes sense in their view of the world. Yeah.
May I follow up on that question about the obstacles? In your experience with this, doesn't it seem, or is this too glib of a generalization, that there's almost like this process of denial that goes on, like, no, this isn't a problem. Well, it might be a problem. Well, it might be a little bit of a problem. Okay, it's a problem. What do you expect me to do? It's not my fault, and so forth, and this kind of resistance to like invasive species in general, whether it's in botany or in biology. But the same thing with concussions and NFL, just to pull a thing out of the air. Have you sort of experienced that? Like, I'm thinking about the email that this one man said, whatever. Is that just something that has to be overcome before finally people start doing something?
Well, I think education is everything, and one of the dynamics going on here is that the lakes, everybody says they love the Great Lakes, but they to, I think, a certain degree lack a real constituency, because unless you fish or you have a house on the lake, and algae that Erin showed in the video doesn't stay on the bottom of the lake, it washes ashore, and it's why Bradford Beach on a hot August day is a putrid place to be sometimes. Those situations notwithstanding, it's hard to get people. It's like a forest that you can't enter. I mean, you stop at the bluff or at the beach, and that's your exposure to what is something that is geographically distinct and glorious as the Himalayas. So it's trying to convey to people what matters out there and why it matters to them. The other thing is the people who are benefiting from the status quo, there's not a lot of them, but they benefit a lot. So they've got a huge stake, and they protect that stake through lobbying and public relations and just selling their story. Whereas the rest of us, we're getting less than the short end of the stick, but it's parceled out on to the individual level, so we don't have this collective voice that the economic interests that are doing the damage has. So, and there's no simple solution to that other than journalism just being there and doing its thing, and hopefully, something happens that forces action at some point.
Would you please discuss increasing chloride loads, both from road salt in the groundwater and in the lakes as it flushes off the surface, along with the heavy metals and other chemicals associated with transportation?
No, I don't know it. I don't know enough. I would just babble. I'm sure Harvey could speak to this during the panel, but I can't talk about that. Okay. Duly noted. And it is an issue, and it's one that we have undercovered.
So I'm from Ohio, and I remember hearing all my friends just be sort of flabbergasted when Toledo's water supply was affected. I'm wondering how you think that will, or if it's changing how people are dealing with these issues, seeing that happen, and if you think other Great Lakes cities are at risk of similar things happening.
I think Toledo is uniquely situated to be exposed to this, but you find yourself in a funny situation where you're almost wanting something to happen to wake people up. And that was kind of the premise of this Toledo algae piece that we did. It was comparing it to the Cuyahoga Fire in 1969. I mean, people were just dumping whatever they wanted into the rivers at that point, and it took a spark dropping from a train to light that river on fire to create the Clean Water Act to finally force industries to stop excreting whatever into the lake. This is, we had the mayor of Chicago 2 weeks ago saying that this changes things. This issue has been out there for years, and this changes things. Whether it does remains to be seen, but I think it is an important event that isn't going to be, and it could very well happen again. It's important to note that when Toledo lost its water on August 2nd, nobody thought it could happen that early in the season because the algae really doesn't start taking off until late August, and I think it's September when it's peak growing. So they can't boil their way out of this. They can't, ferry in water. They'll get through the next crisis, but it's going to be lurking there, and there are solutions, and it's complicated, and it's going to cause some pain for the farming community, and it's probably going to cost more in food. But if you can't drink your own water, then maybe it's time to think about how much we're paying for a gallon of milk.
We'll try to end. If you could just talk about how the fellowship helped you with this and your interaction with students. And
yeah, the fellowship was great. It really, pulled me from the daily grind of the newsroom, where I was not exposed to having to run hither and yon to pick up daily stories. I could just really dive deeply into pretty arcane material. There's no substitute for the time that you need to read and to talk to people, to be able to write with any kind of, for lack of a better word, authority and confidence on these issues. So it was, thank you very much, Frichette's. It was a wonderful year to be able to really, we call it a deep dive, and that's appropriate for the subject material that I'm dealing with. As far as the students, I thought it was really, it was fun to see this issue through eyes that haven't really, considered it before. And I started getting excited when they were putting together the timeline, and I was, helping out and thinking, what would be important. And we start learning about the history of Chicago, really. I mean, Chicago exists because there was basically a breach, or not a breach, but a low spot in the subcontinental divide, the divide that separates the waters of the Great Lakes from the waters of the Mississippi, which meant that a guy in a canoe could now go, once they found this place, and it should be noted that the Native Americans knew about it for hundreds of years. They're the ones who showed Father Marquette how to take a shortcut from the Mississippi River back home. And just learning that history and working with them, it was a lot of fun. And I think Erin didn't mention it, but there were, beyond putting together the timelines and producing the pages, she was a sounding board. I would give her early versions of my stories to show that they don't just come out polished. There are a couple people in this room who do a good job of that, George and Greg, but the early versions are just ideas, and sometimes messy ones. And I wish somebody would have shown me that 10 years, 20, when I was her age.
all right, let's show our appreciation for our panelists, please.